Otter Tail County, Minnesota, September 1884. While every homesteader on the prairie was building bigger fireplaces and stacking more cordwood, Ivan Volkov was doing something that made his neighbors ride over just to argue with him. The 42-year-old Russian immigrant was bricking up his own fireplace, sealing the opening with masonry until only a gap remained that a man could barely fit his fist through. "He's lost his mind," one farmer said. "The fool is bricking himself into a frozen grave." Nobody understood what Ivan knew about smoke that moves too fast. And if you want to find out what happened when January hit -35 degrees and his neighbors discovered why he was smiling, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Ivan Volkov had arrived in Minnesota in the spring of 1879, part of the wave of Russian immigrants who fled the grinding poverty of the Volga region for the promise of free land under the Homestead Act. He'd left behind a village called Kamyshin, where winters arrived in October and didn't release their grip until April, where temperatures dropped to numbers that would kill a man in minutes if he wandered too far from shelter. In Russia, everyone understood that an open fireplace was a death sentence. The massive brick pechka that dominated every peasant home wasn't a luxury, it was survival itself. Ivan had grown up sleeping on top of his family's pechka, the enormous masonry structure that stretched from floor to ceiling and radiated warmth for days from a single firing. His grandfather had explained it simply. Fire is not heat. Smoke is heat. Let the smoke escape too quickly and you've sent your firewood up the chimney. Make the smoke work before it leaves, and a handful of wood does what an armload cannot. The pechka in his childhood home had interior channels that wound back and forth through 6 tons of brick, forcing hot smoke to travel nearly 40 feet before it finally reached the chimney. By the time the smoke escaped, it had surrendered almost all its heat to the masonry. The bricks absorbed this energy during the burn and released it slowly over the following 2 days. 1 firing in the morning, 1 in the evening. And the family stayed warm through nights that would freeze vodka solid in an unheated room. America offered land and opportunity. What it delivered on the prairies of western Minnesota was a style of heating that baffled Ivan completely. His first winters in Otter Tail County were spent working as a farmhand for established Norwegian and German settlers. The cabins he slept in all had the same design. An open fireplace or a cast-iron stove with a straight chimney pipe rising directly to the roof. Heat poured into the room in a roaring blast while the fire burned, then vanished up the flue the moment the flames died. Men woke at midnight, at 2 in the morning, at 4, to feed fires that consumed wood faster than a single man could split it. And every spring, the exhausting cycle began again. Felling, bucking, splitting, stacking. Months of brutal labor just to survive the next winter. Ivan watched this with quiet bewilderment. The smoke leaving these American chimneys was hot enough to melt snow on the roof. Hot smoke meant wasted heat. Wasted heat meant wasted wood. Wasted wood meant wasted labor. Every cabin on the Minnesota prairie was sending half its firewood straight into the sky. By 1884, Ivan had saved enough from 5 years of farm work to claim his own 160 acres, 12 miles northwest of Fergus Falls. The land came with a small cabin built by a previous homesteader who had given up and returned east. The cabin had a stone fireplace, a gaping mouth 4 feet wide that could swallow logs whole and send their heat roaring up the chimney in minutes. His nearest neighbor, a Norwegian farmer named Lars Henriksen, watched the Russian immigrant inspect the fireplace with an expression that suggested he was measuring for a coffin, rather than admiring the stonework. "Good fireplace," Henriksen offered, gesturing at the opening. "Previous man built it solid. Takes a full cord a week in January. Aye, but it throws heat." "It throws heat up the chimney," Ivan replied, his English still heavy with Russian rhythm. "I will fix this." "Fix it? There's nothing wrong with it." "Everything is wrong with it. The smoke leaves too fast. I will make the smoke work before it goes." Henriksen stared at him for a long moment. You're going to do what to it? The argument with his wife Yelena began the morning Ivan showed her exactly what he intended to do to their fireplace. He walked her to the hearth they had used for 2 winters, the same stone fireplace every cabin in the county relied upon, and explained that he was going to brick up nearly the entire opening, leaving only a small firebox door at the bottom. Then he was going to tear out the straight chimney and replace it with a winding labyrinth of brick channels that would force the smoke to travel 30 feet before it ever reached outside air. You want to seal our fireplace? Yelena said, staring at the opening that had kept them alive through 2 Minnesota winters. You want to brick up the only thing standing between our children and death. The fireplace is killing us slowly. We burn 4 cords every winter and still wake to frost on the floor. The heat goes up the chimney. 90 of every 100 units of warmth we create, gone into the sky. I am not sealing the fireplace. I am making it work. And if you are wrong, if your bricks crack or your channels clog, we freeze. The children freeze. Everything we have built here ends in one cold night. I am not wrong. I watched my grandfather heat a house 3 times this size with a stove you could feed once in the morning and once at night. The smoke traveled through the masonry for 20 feet before it escaped. The bricks held the heat for days. This is not invention, Yelena. This is what our people have known for 300 years. Word reached their nearest neighbor within the week. Lars Lindqvist, a Swedish farmer who had helped Ivan raise the cabin walls 2 years earlier, rode over and found the Russian standing inside his fireplace with a trowel, laying the first course of fire bricks across the opening. Volkov, Lindqvist called from the doorway, his expression caught between concern and disbelief. What in God's name are you doing to your hearth? Making it efficient. You're bricking it up. You're sealing your own fireplace shut 3 months before winter. I am leaving a firebox, small, controlled. The smoke will travel through channels in the masonry, up, across, down, across, up again, before it exits. By the time it reaches the chimney, it will have given all its heat to the bricks. The bricks will radiate that heat into the room for 2 days. Lindqvist stepped closer and studied the work in progress. You're building a maze inside your chimney. A labyrinth, 30 feet of path where there was 6. Every foot of travel is heat captured instead of heat lost. And if the draft fails, if the smoke backs up, the draft will not fail. The physics are sound. The confrontation at the general store in Fergus Falls came the following week when Ivan arrived to purchase more fire bricks. A group of farmers gathered near the counter had already heard about the Russian who was bricking up his fireplace. Volkov's finally lost his mind, one said loud enough for Ivan to hear. Sealing his hearth shut with winter coming. His wife ought to stop him before he kills the whole family. Perhaps he is building his own tomb, another laughed. Ice saves the neighbors the trouble of digging a grave in frozen ground. Ivan loaded his wagon without responding. He had heard worse in Russia from men who clung to open hearths while their grandparents' knowledge sat ignored. Those men burned forests to stay cold. Ivan's grandfather had heated a farmhouse with an armload of wood and a little patience. The Americans would learn. Or they would keep burning. What Ivan Volkov understood from generations of Russian stove builders, modern combustion engineering would later quantify with precision. But the principles he was applying had been refined in Russian villages for centuries. Massive masonry stoves called pechka that heated entire farmhouses through the brutal winters of a land where firewood was precious and cold was a constant enemy. Heat captured is heat kept. Heat escaped is heat wasted. The fundamental problem with an open fireplace is speed. Fire generates smoke at temperatures between 600 and 1,000 degrees. In a conventional hearth with a straight chimney, that superheated smoke travels directly upward and exits the structure within seconds, carrying the vast majority of its thermal energy into the sky. Studies would later confirm what Russian peasants had known for generations. An open fireplace sends 70 to 90% of its heat straight up the flue. The flames feel warm because radiant energy reaches the room, but the actual heat content of the combustion gases disappears before it can be captured. Ivan's solution was elegantly simple. Slow the smoke down. Force it to travel a longer path before escaping. Every additional foot of contact between hot smoke and cool masonry meant more heat transferred from gas to brick. A 6-foot straight chimney gave smoke 6 feet of opportunity to surrender its heat. A 30-foot labyrinth of channels gave smoke 30 feet, 5 times the extraction distance. The channels worked through a principle called counterflow heat exchange. Hot smoke entered at the bottom and traveled upward through the first vertical channel. At the top, it turned and descended through a second channel. At the bottom, it turned again and rose through a third. Each turn forced the smoke against fresh brick surfaces that had not yet absorbed heat. By the time the smoke completed its serpentine journey and exited the final flue, its temperature had dropped from 800 degrees to barely 200, meaning 600 degrees of thermal energy had been captured by the masonry instead of escaping into the Minnesota sky. The massive brick structure then acted as a thermal battery. Brick absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. 1,000 pounds of masonry heated to 150 degrees will radiate that warmth into a room for 24 to 48 hours, here the temperature declining gradually rather than crashing the moment the fire dies. This meant Ivan could burn one hot fire in the morning, let it extinguish completely, and the masonry would continue warming his cabin through the night and into the next day without any additional fuel. The small firebox door served a critical function beyond simple sealing. Controlled air intake meant complete combustion. The fire burned hotter and cleaner with less smoke and more heat extraction per pound of wood. An open fireplace gobbles air and wastes fuel. A sealed firebox with calculated air supply burns the same wood at higher efficiency, extracting more energy from less material. The physics told the story in numbers. A conventional open fireplace burning 4 cords of wood per winter captured perhaps 10 to 20% of the available heat energy. Ivan's masonry labyrinth would capture 80 to 90%. The same heating result from 1/4 the fuel, or 4 times the heat from the same fuel. Either way, the math transformed survival. His neighbor saw a man bricking up his hearth. Ivan saw centuries of Russian engineering being applied to American materials. The brick was local. The mortar was standard. The channels required nothing more than careful planning and patient labor. The only innovation was having the knowledge to build what his grandfather's generation had considered ordinary. A stove that captured heat instead of throwing it away, that turned smoke into warmth instead of letting it escape. That made firewood a resource instead of a desperate race against consumption. Construction began in early September of 1884, starting with destruction. Ivan spent the first 3 days tearing out the straight stone chimney that had served the cabin for 2 winters, pulling stones loose one by one and stacking them outside. What had taken a week to build came down in 72 hours of brutal labor, leaving a gaping hole in the roof and a pile of rubble where the hearth had stood. Yelena watched the demolition with her arms crossed and her jaw set. Every stone that came down was another piece of their survival removed, but she said nothing. She had married Ivan knowing he carried knowledge she did not understand, knowledge passed down through generations of Russian winters that made Minnesota seem mild by comparison. The foundation came first. Ivan laid a base of fire bricks across the entire hearth area, ice extending the footprint 3 feet deeper into the room than the original fireplace. This was not a modification. This was a complete replacement. A masonry thermal mass that would weigh nearly 2 tons when completed. The firebox rose from the center of the foundation, a small chamber lined entirely with fire bricks capable of withstanding temperatures that would crack ordinary masonry. The opening measured 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall, Barely enough space to feed split wood through a cast-iron door Ivan had ordered from a foundry in St. Paul. Neighbors who stopped by stared at the tiny opening and shook their heads. A child could barely crawl through it. How could such a small fire heat an entire cabin? Above the firebox, Ivan began constructing the labyrinth. Instead of a straight vertical chimney that would rush smoke and heat directly into the sky, he built a series of horizontal channels connected by vertical rises, a serpentine path that forced the smoke to travel up, then across, then down, then across again, then up once more before finally reaching the exit flue. Each channel was built from common brick, 8 inches wide and 8 inches tall, with smooth interior surfaces to prevent creosote buildup. By late September, the structure had risen to chest height, the channels snaking back and forth through the growing mass of masonry. Lars Lindqvist rode over to inspect the progress and spent 20 minutes walking around the structure, trying to trace the smoke path through the maze. "How far does the smoke travel before it escapes?" Lindqvist asked. 32 feet. The original chimney was 6. And you believe the draft will pull through all those turns? The draft will pull. Hot air rises. As long as the exit is higher than the entrance, the smoke will find its way. The turns slow it down. They do not stop it. The final courses went up in early October, the structure now reaching the ceiling where a single exit flue penetrated the roof. Ivan sealed every joint with fire clay, mortaring the bricks so tightly that no smoke could escape, except through the intended path. Small cast-iron clean-out doors were installed at each turn, allowing access to sweep the channels when creosote accumulated. On October 15th, with the first hard frost already silvering the grass each morning, Ivan lit the inaugural fire. He used only a small handful of kindling and 3 split logs, a fraction of what the old fireplace would have required. Yelena stood near the door, ready to flee with the children if smoke began pouring into the room. The kindling caught. The logs ignited. Smoke rose from the flames and disappeared into the labyrinth. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a thin wisp of white smoke emerged from the exit flue outside, barely visible against the gray October sky. Ivan pressed his palm against the outer bricks. Cool. The heat was still working its way through the channels. By morning, the entire mass would be warm to the touch. By late October, Ivan Volkov's bricked-up fireplace had become the most discussed construction in Otter Tail County. Farmers made detours past the Volkov homestead just to see the squat masonry structure that had replaced the traditional hearth, its tiny firebox door and complete absence of a proper fireplace opening, confirming what everyone already believed. The Russian had gone mad. The reactions had shifted from amusement to genuine alarm. "It is not a fireplace," one farmer declared at the general store in Fergus Falls. "It is a brick oven with no purpose. The man has sealed himself inside a tomb and expects his family to survive on whatever heat escapes through the cracks." "The smoke will back up," another agreed. "First cold snap and that maze of his will clog with creosote. He will either suffocate or freeze. One or the other. Someone ought to talk sense to the wife. Get her to take the children to relatives before the killing cold comes." Lars Lindqvist returned in early November to inspect the completed structure. He had watched Ivan work through September and October, had traced the labyrinth with his eyes and asked his questions about draft and physics. Now he wanted to see the thing in operation. He found Ivan feeding the morning fire. 3 small logs pushed through the 14-inch opening, flames visible through the cast-iron door's air vents. The room was warm. Not the scorching, uneven heat of an open hearth that burned your face while your back froze, but a gentle surrounding warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Touch the wall," Ivan said. Lindqvist walked to the masonry structure and pressed his palm against the outer bricks. Warm. Not hot, but distinctly warm, the heat radiating steadily from deep within the mass. "This is from last night's fire?" "I fed it once last evening." Once this morning. Perhaps 8 logs total. Feel the floor near the base. Lindqvist crouched and touched the wooden floorboards near the masonry foundation. Warm. The heat was radiating downward as well as outward, warming the entire cabin from its center. October is not the test, Lindqvist said, straightening. January is the test. When it drops to 30 below and stays there for a week, we will see if your labyrinth still draws. The labyrinth will draw. The physics do not change with temperature. Your neighbors say you will freeze. They say the channels will clog and the smoke will fill the cabin. My neighbors say many things. My grandfather's Petch heated a house for 40 years without failing. The design is proven. Only the location is new. Yelena had stopped arguing by mid-November. The evidence was too clear to dispute. Each morning she woke to a cabin that held warmth from the previous day's fires. Each evening she watched Ivan feed a handful of logs into the small firebox, a fraction of what the old fireplace had consumed. And within an hour, the entire masonry mass radiated gentle heat that lasted through the night. She pressed her palm against the warm bricks one November morning while Ivan was outside splitting wood. The heat was constant, steady, patient. Not the desperate roaring heat of an open fire that demanded constant feeding. But something deeper. Something that felt like the earth itself had decided to warm her home. The woodpile beside the cabin told the real story. By mid-November in previous years, they had already burned through a full cord. This year, the pile had barely diminished. Ivan split wood for an hour each week instead of an hour each day. The children no longer woke to frost on their blankets. Yelena said nothing to the neighbor women who still whispered about her husband's madness. Let them whisper. January would answer every question. January 1885 arrived with a brutality that the old settlers in Otter Tail County would reference for decades. An Arctic front descended from Manitoba on January 8th, driving temperatures from a manageable 5 degrees above zero to 15 below by midnight. By dawn on January 9th, the mercury had plunged to 26 below. And on the morning of January 12th, the thermometer outside Lars Lindqvist's barn read 35 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to kill livestock caught unsheltered, cold enough to test every fireplace and stove in the county to its breaking point. The wind made it worse. Prairie gusts swept across the frozen landscape at 20 miles per hour, finding every gap in every cabin wall, every crack around every door frame, to stealing heat faster than any fire could replace it. Smoke columns rose from chimneys across the county like desperate signals, families burning through cordwood at rates that emptied wood piles and broke spirits. Lars Lindqvist fed his cast-iron stove around the clock. He woke at 2 in the morning to add logs, woke again at 5, fed it continuously through the day. The stove glowed cherry red, too hot to approach within 3 feet, yet frost crept across the floor 8 feet away. His children slept in their coats. His wife piled every blanket they owned onto the beds and still shivered through the nights. By January 14th, he had burned through half the cordwood he had stacked for the entire winter. The Hendrickson family 3 miles south lost their chimney on the 3rd night. The mortar cracked from the temperature differential between the roaring fire inside and the killing cold outside, opening gaps that leaked smoke into the cabin. They stuffed rags into the cracks and burned smaller fires, choosing slow freezing over suffocation. Old Eric Dahl, a bachelor farmer who lived alone on 80 acres of marginal land, ran out of firewood on January 13th. A search party found him 2 days later, frozen in his chair beside a cold stove, an axe clutched in hands too numb to swing it. He had died trying to rise for more wood that was not there. At the Volkov homestead, January 8th began like every other winter morning. Ivan woke before dawn, walked to the masonry heater and opened the small firebox door. Coals still glowed from the previous evening's fire, the labyrinth holding heat through the night. And he added 4 split logs, birch, dried for 2 years, and closed the door. Within 30 minutes, fresh heat would begin radiating from the 2-ton mass of brick. By the time temperatures plunged to 35 below, the Volkov cabin held steady at 58 degrees. Ivan fed the heater twice daily, morning and evening, using perhaps 10 logs in 24 hours. The massive thermal mass absorbed each fire's heat over several hours, then radiated that heat slowly and continuously through the following day and night. No desperate midnight feedings, no glowing red surfaces too hot to approach. Just steady, patient warmth that came from everywhere at once. The children played on the floor in their ordinary clothes. Yelena cooked and sewed without wearing her coat indoors. At night, the family slept beneath normal blankets and woke to a cabin that had dropped perhaps 3 degrees overnight, the masonry still releasing stored heat from the previous day's fires. On January 15th, Lars Lindqvist sent his eldest son to check on the Russian family. The boy had explicit instructions. If they were dead, ride immediately to Fergus Falls for the sheriff. If they were alive but suffering, bring them back to the Lindqvist farm, where at least they could share body heat and firewood. The boy returned 2 hours later with a look on his face that Lindqvist had never seen before. "They are fine, father. They are completely fine." Lars Lindqvist arrived at the Volkov homestead on January 17th, 9 days into the worst cold snap anyone in the county could remember. His face was raw and haggard, dark circles carved beneath eyes that had not seen proper sleep in over a week. His beard carried frost from the short ride between farms, and his hands trembled even inside heavy mittens. He found Ivan Volkov outside, calmly splitting wood. Not frantically, not desperately. Calmly, the steady rhythm of a man maintaining a supply rather than fighting for survival. The woodpile beside the cabin remained substantial, barely touched compared to the devastation Lindqvist had inflicted on his own supply. "Volkov," Lindqvist called, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I need to see inside." Ivan set down the axe and gestured toward the cabin door. "Come, warm yourself." Lindqvist stepped through the doorway and stopped 3 paces inside. The air was warm. Not the searing, desperate heat of a roaring stove that burned your face while your kidneys froze, but an even, gentle warmth that surrounded him from every direction. Floor, walls, ceiling. The massive brick structure at the center of the room radiating heat like a living thing. "Where is the fire?" Lindqvist asked, turning slowly. "Burning. Inside the firebox. You cannot see it. The door is closed. I fed it 2 hours ago. I will feed it again this evening." 2 hours ago. Lindqvist walked to the masonry heater and pressed his palm against the outer bricks. Warm, steadily, deeply warm, the heat coming not from the surface but from somewhere far inside the mass. "This heat is from 2 hours ago?" "This heat is from yesterday. And the day before, and the day before that. The bricks, remember. They hold what the fire gives them and release it slowly. Touch the other side." Lindqvist circled the structure and pressed his palm against the opposite face. The same warmth. He touched the bricks near the ceiling. Warm. He crouched and touched the base. Warm. Every surface of the 2-ton mass radiated the same gentle, constant heat. "What temperature does your cabin hold?" Ivan pointed to a thermometer hanging on the wall near the bedroom doorway. "See for yourself." Lindqvist walked to the thermometer and leaned close. 56 degrees. Outside, the morning had registered 31 below zero. A differential of 87 degrees, maintained by a fire he could not even see. "How much wood?" Lindqvist asked quietly. How much wood are you burning each day?" 8 logs, perhaps 10, split to the width of my wrist. I feed the firebox twice, morning and evening. The labyrinth does the rest. 8 logs. Lindqvist's voice cracked. I have burned 40 logs a day for 9 days. I have burned half my winter's wood in 9 days, and my children still sleep in their coats. My wife weeps from the cold. And you burn 8 logs, and your family walks about in shirt sleeves. The open hearth is a thief. It takes your wood and sends the heat into the sky. The labyrinth is a bank. It takes the same heat and stores it in the bricks. The bricks pay it back slowly with interest for 2 days after the fire dies. Lindqvist stood in the center of the warm cabin, surrounded by evidence that everything he knew about heating was wrong. His own stove, he fed continuously, could not match what this strange brick maze accomplished on a handful of wood fed twice a day. "Can you teach me?" The words came out rough, stripped of pride. "Can you teach me to build one of these?" Ivan smiled, the first smile Lindqvist had ever seen on the Russian's weathered face. "I can teach anyone who is willing to tear down what does not work." The first visitors after Lars Lindqvist were the Hendricksons, who arrived on January 19th with their 3 children bundled in every blanket they owned. Their cabin with the cracked chimney had become uninhabitable. Smoke or cold, they had to choose one or the other, and they had chosen to seek help rather than choose between suffocation and freezing. "Stay as long as you need," Yelena said, guiding the exhausted family inside. "There is room. The warmth is enough for all of us." Mrs. Hendrickson stopped 3 steps through the doorway, her eyes scanning the cabin for the roaring fire that must exist but did not. She pressed her palm against the masonry heater and held it there, feeling the steady warmth radiating from deep within the bricks. "This heat," she whispered. "Where does this heat come from?" "From yesterday's fire. And tomorrow's fire will warm us the day after." The bricks remember. By the end of January, Ivan had hosted 4 families in the cabin, some seeking refuge from failed heating systems, others simply needing to stand inside and feel the impossible for themselves. The structure that the county had called a tomb was now the warmest shelter for miles, and everyone who entered left with the same stunned expression Lars Lindqvist had worn. Lindqvist was first to commit to learning. He arrived in early February with his 2 eldest sons and a notebook, prepared to understand everything Ivan could teach. "We must start with destruction," Ivan explained, walking Lindqvist through the principles. "Your stove cannot be modified. Your fireplace cannot be improved. They must be torn out completely and replaced with masonry. 2 tons of brick arranged so the smoke must travel 30 feet before it escapes. Every foot of travel is heat captured." He spent 4 days teaching the fundamentals. How to lay a fire brick firebox that could withstand intense heat. How to construct the serpentine channels that force smoke to surrender its heat before escaping. How to calculate the proper mass for a given cabin size. How to install clean-out doors for maintenance. How to seal joints with fire clay so no smoke could escape except through the intended path. "You are giving away everything," Yelena observed one evening after another group of farmers had departed with pages of sketches and notes. "Knowledge kept in one cabin helps one family," Ivan replied. "Knowledge carried across the county helps everyone. Like in Russia, every village had men who understood the pech. Here I am, the only one. If I keep silent, children freeze in cabins with roaring fires that heat nothing but the sky." The first new construction began at the Lindqvist farm in late April. Ivan supervised personally, watching as Lars and his sons tore out the cast-iron stove that had failed them and began laying the foundation for a proper masonry heater. The work took 3 weeks, careful, methodical, each brick placed with attention to the path the smoke would travel. By June, 2 more farmers had begun similar projects. The Fergus Falls newspaper ran a story in August about the Russian method of masonry heating. Letters arrived from across Minnesota, from farmers in Wisconsin and the Dakotas, eyeing from anyone desperate for an alternative to the endless, brutal cycle of cutting and splitting and burning that still left families shivering through the nights. Ivan answered every letter. He drew diagrams, explained principles, described the relationship between mass and heat and time. He charged nothing. In Russia, the knowledge of the Pech belonged to everyone. The winters belonged to everyone. Why should survival belong only to those who can pay? Yelena no longer argued. She watched her husband teach and remembered the January nights when her children had slept warm while the county froze around them. Some things were worth more than money. Ivan Volkov lived another 34 years in that cabin. He died in 1918, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up in a home where winter was an inconvenience rather than a battle, where no one woke at midnight to feed a desperate fire, where warmth came from bricks that remembered yesterday's flames. The masonry heater he built in 1884 stood for 73 years, finally dismantled in 1957 when the cabin was torn down to make way for a modern farmhouse. The fire bricks showed no cracks. The labyrinth channels were clean and clear. The structure had never failed, not once, through 7 decades of Minnesota winters. The cold snap of January 1885 remained the benchmark against which all subsequent winters were measured. Old farmers would ask each other, "Cold as 85?" And the answer was almost never yes. But lesser winters still exhausted families who fed stoves around the clock, still sent men to the woodpile before dawn, still consumed forests at rates the land could not sustain. Every sleepless night spent feeding a hungry fire reminded someone of what the Russian had proven possible with 2 tons of brick and a little patience. By 1895, masonry heaters had spread beyond Otter Tail County, into neighboring regions across Minnesota and into the Dakotas. Agricultural journals published articles about the Russian method of thermal mass heating. The Minnesota State Agricultural Society invited Ivan to speak in 1902. The immigrant once mocked for bricking up his own fireplace, now addressing an audience of 200 farmers and builders. "The open hearth is a thief," Ivan told them through his still thick Russian accent. "It takes your labor and your wood and your sleep and gives you cold floors and frozen mornings in return. The masonry heater is honest. It takes only what it needs and returns everything it takes. You feed it twice and it warms you for days. Your grandfathers knew this. Their grandfathers knew this. The knowledge is not new. Only the forgetting is new." Lars Lindqvist never went back to his cast iron stove. The masonry heater he built under Ivan's supervision in 1885 cut his wood consumption by 2/3 and kept his family warm through every subsequent winter without a single midnight feeding. His sons built their own heaters on their own homesteads, and the Lindqvist family remained in Otter Tail County for 4 generations, each one sleeping warmer than their neighbors who clung to the old ways. The principle Ivan understood, using thermal mass to capture heat from combustion gases before they escape, then radiating that stored heat slowly over days, appears today in every modern masonry heater on the planet. Finnish contraflow stoves, Russian Pechs, Austrian Kachelofens, American masonry heaters, all descendants of the same ancient knowledge that Ivan carried across an ocean and built into a Minnesota cabin while his neighbors called him mad. What Ivan knew, what generations of Russian, Finnish, and Germanic craftsmen knew, was that fighting winter with constant fire was choosing exhaustion when patience offered warmth. His neighbors burned and fed and burned and fed, slaves to stoves that devoured their labor. Ivan fed his heater twice a day and let the bricks do the remembering. Yelena outlived Ivan by 6 years. She spent her final winters pressing her palms against the same warm bricks she had touched that November morning when doubt gave way to wonder. After she passed, their daughter found a note tucked into the family Bible, written in Yelena's careful Russian script. "I called him mad when he bricked up our fireplace. I told him he would freeze our children. He smiled and kept laying bricks. For 34 winters I woke to warmth that came from nowhere I could see. The neighbors burned forests, we burned handfuls. He did not argue with my doubt, he answered it with bricks.